Have you ever been in a public place and suddenly felt like you didn't belong? That morning at a busy international airport, a black woman dressed casually speaking calmly was asked to leave the priority area simply because of procedure. No one shouted. There was no arguing. Only a quiet choice lay before her. Should you walk away in silence or stop everything? No one on the plane knew who she was. No one knew that with just a small gesture, she could cause the entire flight to not take off. If you were judged solely on your appearance, if you were treated as if you were unworthy, what would you do? Will you swallow your anger as you have so many times before? Or will you choose to speak up even knowing it might mess things up? This story isn't about revenge. It's about the boundaries of self-respect, about the moment a person decides, this is enough. If you've ever stayed silent for fear of trouble, if you've ever wondered, maybe I'm just too sensitive, then this story is for you. Let's embark on that journey together. And if you feel this story resonates with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can begin. No one in the crowded Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport terminal that morning recognized Naomi Carter. She stood in the priority check-in area of North Sky Airways as quietly as anyone else waiting their turn on any other Monday morning. The white light from the ceiling reflected off the polished granite floor. The sound of rolling suitcases on the floor mingled with the announcements over the loudspeaker, creating the familiar sounds of people in a hurry. Naomi wore a straight-cut, unbranded ash gray wool coat. She had black trousers and worn but clean flat shoes. A brown leather bag, slightly worn at the edges, rested on her shoulder. Her curly hair was neatly styled in a bun at the nape of her neck. At first glance, it was easy to mistake her for a middle-aged woman hurrying to a business trip or a university lecturer taking an early flight. She took a step forward as the line in front of her moved. And then everything stopped. "Ma'am?" A voice rang out, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the moving crowd. Naomi looked up. In front of her was Ethan Brooks, the check-in manager. He was in his late 30s, wearing a well-fitting dark blue suit and a neatly tied tie. His name tag, pinned to his left chest, gleamed brightly under the lights. "Ma'am," Ethan repeated, his gaze sweeping from Naomi's face down to the leather bag on her shoulder, then settling on her flat shoes. "This line is for priority and first-class passengers." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "Yes," she replied, her voice low and calm. "I know." She held up the ticket, a white boarding pass with smooth, unwrinkled edges. Ethan didn't take it right away. He looked at the ticket, then at Naomi, as if the two things didn't belong together. "Ma'am," he said slowly, his smile polite but cold, "I'm going to need you to use the economy line. It's around the corner." The air around us seemed to freeze for a single breath. A man behind them let out a soft sigh, clearly annoyed. A woman in a designer coat glanced at Naomi, then quickly turned away, her lips pressed together. No one said anything, but everyone heard it. Naomi didn't react immediately. She looked straight at Ethan, her eyes devoid of confusion or anger. Just a brief, very brief moment where she seemed to be contemplating something within herself. "Is there a problem with my ticket?" she asked. Ethan's lips curled slightly. "The system sometimes malfunctions." And he paused for half a second. "We need to ensure this area is being used by the right people." The word object fell heavily upon them. Naomi could clearly feel the eyes fixed on her back. No one openly sided with her. No one opposed Ethan. It was a familiar silence she had encountered many times in her life. The silence of those who didn't want trouble, of those who thought this didn't concern them. She took a very light breath. "Okay," Naomi said. Just one word. No raising her voice. No arguing. She collected her ticket and turned. Her leather bag brushed lightly against her hip as she walked away. No one stopped her. No one apologized. The crowd behind her immediately moved forward, filling the space she had just left as if she had never been there. The economy line was behind a large pillar where the lighting was no longer soft. Naomi stood in line in front of a young man with an old backpack, behind an older woman clutching a cloth bag. No one here was dressed in a formal suit. No one seemed important. Naomi stared straight ahead. Her heart was beating steadily, but inside a very thin string had just been pulled taut. She recalled the early years of her career. The boardrooms where she was the only black person. The times her ideas were dismissed, then reiterated by someone else, and praised, the polite smiles, the ambiguous remarks. She learned one thing very early on. It's not always necessary to speak up immediately. Sometimes silence isn't a sign of defeat. Silence is waiting for the right moment. Naomi opened her bag and took out her phone. The screen lit up. She looked at an unread email. Its subject line short and simple. She didn't open it immediately. She just looked at it. Then she turned off the screen. In the distance, the priority check-in area was still brightly lit. Ethan Brooks was chatting and laughing with the next passenger, his voice friendly as if nothing had happened. Naomi stood silently in the economy class, and no one in that terminal knew that in just a few hours this entire flight would not take off as they had planned. Economy class trains move slowly, much slower than priority class trains. Naomi Carter stood still, her hands resting lightly on the handles of her small black suitcase. She didn't look at her watch, though she knew perfectly well she still had plenty of time. Years of experience in meetings meant she always knew exactly where she stood on her schedule. But right now, Naomi wasn't concerned about the flight. But it felt very familiar. It felt like she was being seen right through. Not a direct stare, but rather as if she wasn't important. Ahead of Naomi stood a young man, probably in his early 20s. He wore a faded hoodie and carried a worn-out backpack. He kept checking his phone, his face tense. Perhaps it was his first flight in a long time. Perhaps it was an interview. Naomi didn't know, but she recognized that look. The look of someone hopeful yet unsure if they would be treated kindly. Behind her was an elderly woman with gray hair clutching a cloth bag tightly as if it were something very important. With each step forward, she breathed a sigh of relief, as if she had just overcome another long journey. Naomi stood between them, and for the first time that morning she felt a little lighter. Here no one asks her who she is. No one doubts whether she belongs to this place. No one needs her to prove anything. She closed her eyes for a very brief moment. The first image that came to Naomi's mind wasn't Ethan Brooks, nor the brightly lit priority check-in area. It was a small kitchen in South Chicago, more than 30 years ago. Her mother stood by the sink, wearing yellow rubber gloves, dish soap running in a stream. The smell mingled with the lingering scent of leftover food from dinner. Naomi, then 12 years old, sat at the dining table doing her math homework. "Mom," Naomi asked, her eyes still fixed on her notebook. "Why do people always think you work here? Because you have no other choice." Her mother didn't turn around. But Naomi heard a soft breath. Then a deep, warm voice, very calm. "My dear," her mother said, "what people think doesn't determine my value. How I do my work does." That saying stayed with Naomi throughout her life. She remembered the first time she walked into a large conference room in her early 20s. She was the only black person, the only woman. She was more prepared than anyone else. But when she began her presentation, an older man interrupted her. "That's an interesting idea," he said, then turned to the other person. "What do you think?" Naomi sat down. No objections, no arguments. She took notes, observed, and when asked again, she presented her findings more clearly and coherently. Not to prove she was good, but to ensure the work was done correctly. She learned to survive in spaces not designed for her, not by becoming louder, but by becoming more resilient. The economy class moved forward another step. Naomi opened her eyes. In the distance, she saw the priority check-in area was still lit. Ethan Brooks was smiling at a passenger in an expensive coat. The way he leaned, the way he nodded, the way his voice lowered, becoming friendlier. Naomi didn't feel angry. She just took note. She wondered very softly, if I had reacted differently, then would anything have changed? The answer is obvious. No. Naomi had tried before. In the past. Speaking up, asking for respect, sometimes it worked. But mostly, it only led to her being labeled difficult to work with, sensitive, overreacting. She learned that in an unfair system, emotional reactions often only expose weaknesses. Silence, when combined with preparation, can become a strength. Naomi's phone vibrated slightly in her hand. She looked down. A text message. Not long. Documents finalized. Awaiting your signal. Naomi didn't reply immediately. She locked the screen. Her fingers rested on the edge of the phone, feeling the cool metal. Inside her, there was a slight internal struggle. It's not a struggle between right and wrong. It's about deciding where we should go. She knew that if she wanted to, It could all be over very quickly. Just one phone call, one signature, one order. But Naomi also knew that power shouldn't always be used to retaliate against personal insults. The real question is this just about me or about something bigger? Naomi glanced around the economy class again. The young man in front was muttering something as if practicing for an interview. The woman behind him shifted slightly, trying to reduce pressure on her knees. Naomi understood perfectly well. If she ignored it, if she simply boarded the plane, sat in her seat, and flew away, the system would continue to operate as before. Ethan Brooks would still be standing there tomorrow, and the day after, and many others would be standing in her place this morning. That thought didn't anger Naomi. It made her feel down. She's not the type to teach anyone a lesson, but she believes in responsibility. The responsibility of those who have the ability to bring about change when they truly see the problem. It's almost her turn to wear the economy class clothes. The check-in clerk at this counter was an Asian man in his early 30s. His name tag read Marcus Lee. His eyes looked tired but not cold. When he saw Naomi, he nodded slightly, very naturally. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," Naomi replied. There was no doubt, no unnecessary questions. Marcus Lee took the ticket and scanned it. The screen lit up. He frowned slightly, then looked at Naomi. "Ma'am," he said more softly, as if he didn't want anyone else to hear. "Seat assignment says first class." Naomi looked at him. Their eyes met for a very brief moment. "Is there a problem?" Naomi asked. Marcus Lee hesitated. Then he shook his head. "No, I just wanted to confirm." Naomi smiled faintly. Not a triumphant smile. Just an acknowledgement. "It's all right." Marcus printed a new ticket and handed it to her carefully with both hands. "Have a pleasant flight, ma'am." "Thank you," Naomi said. She held her ticket and walked through security. As she left, she didn't look back at Ethan Brooks. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew the moment of true confrontation hadn't arrived yet. In the distance, the loudspeaker announced that boarding time was about to begin. Naomi stood in the security line, took off her shoes, and placed her bag on the conveyor belt. Everything happened slowly, very ordinarily. But in her mind, a decision was gradually forming. No rushing, no emotions, just clear and straightforward. Naomi Carter didn't come to the airport this morning to prove who she is. But perhaps before leaving, she will force a few people to reconsider how they treat those they consider not to belong. She walked through the security gate. The machine didn't beep. As usual, Naomi put her shoes back on, grabbed her bag, and headed towards the boarding gate. Ahead, a North Sky Airways flight awaits. And with it came another silence. Greater, heavier, waiting to be broken. The security check area at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport was always the same. The fluorescent lights were a dull white. The floor was cold. A long, winding line stretched like an endless river. Naomi Carter stood in the middle of it, her suitcase close to her feet, clutching her freshly printed ticket. She noticed a very small thing. In the priority section, people barely look at each other. It's different here. In the economy, line eyes meet more often. Not for long, not out of curiosity, just enough to confirm I see you. A middle-aged man standing a few steps away from Naomi turned and smiled slightly as the line moved forward. It was a polite but genuine smile. Naomi nodded in return. No one said anything more, but that moment was very real. In front of her, the young man with the old backpack finally looked up from his phone. He turned to Naomi, looking a little embarrassed. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low. "Do you know whether the boarding gate is on the left or right after security?" "It's been a long time since I last flew." Naomi smiled. "To the right, but the electronic display will show you." "Thank you," he replied, visibly relieved. "I was afraid of going the wrong way." "You're not going to the wrong place," Naomi said. "Everyone has to relearn a little bit each time they come back." The young man smiled, a slightly embarrassed but sincere smile. "Yes." The conversation ended there. But Naomi realized that even a small remark was enough to ease the tension in his eyes. She recalled an evening long ago when she herself stood in a similar line. Not at the airport, but in an office building waiting for the final interview for a position she knew she was qualified for. The man in front of her then turned around and asked, "Are you also applying for this position?" Naomi nodded. He looked her up and down, then gave a faint smile. "Good luck." She said nothing, But the feeling of being judged before being listened to never left her. The security guards advanced again. Naomi took off her watch and placed it in a plastic tray. The watch wasn't expensive, not because she couldn't afford something more expensive, but because she preferred things that were durable and unpretentious. A security officer gestured for her to walk through the scanner. Naomi complied. No beep. No one stopped her. She stepped to the other side, as calmly as she always did when navigating uncertain spaces. In the area where items are retrieved, Naomi sees Marcus Lee. He was helping an elderly woman get her suitcase off the conveyor belt. She struggled the suitcase heavier than she looked. Marcus bent down, lifted it, and gently placed it on the ground. "Thank you," she said, letting out a long sigh. "Nothing, ma'am," Marcus replied. "Long flights are always tiring." Naomi stood waiting for her bag. She watched the scene, not with overwhelming emotion, but with a very familiar feeling. Quiet kindness. No applause. No recognition. But without people like that, things would be so much harsher. Marcus Lee turned back to the small counter nearby, saw Naomi, and nodded slightly. "I hope your flight will be pleasant," he said. Naomi responded with a very slight smile. "I hope so too." She pulled her suitcase and walked towards the boarding gate. The closer she got to the boarding gate, the different the atmosphere became. More people, noisier, families with young children, elderly people looking for seats, urgent phone calls. Naomi found an empty seat near the window and sat down. She placed her bag on her lap, her hand on the zipper. The flight hadn't boarded yet, but many passengers had already gathered around the gate, afraid of missing out. She observed them one by one. An elderly couple holding hands. A man in a worker's uniform dozing in a chair. A young woman clutching her laptop, typing incessantly as if she couldn't stop. None of them looked important, but Naomi knew that each person here carried a story, a life, a series of struggles that weren't always visible. She wondered how many of them had been told they didn't belong somewhere, not just at the airport, but in boardrooms, in schools, in hospitals, in spaces labeled for others. Naomi's phone vibrated again. She looked down. A call. The caller's name was displayed. Rachel Thompson. Naomi didn't pick up the phone right away. She looked out the large window in front of her where the planes were parked, their wingspans and metal bodies reflecting the morning light. Each plane held hundreds of people, hundreds of stories crammed together in a confined space, flying in the same direction, but not necessarily in the same position. She picked up the phone. Rachel's voice rang out low and rapid. "I know you're at the airport. I just wanted to confirm. Are you okay?" Naomi was silent for a second. "I'm fine. Is something wrong?" Rachel asked. No beating around the bush. No small talk. Naomi looked around. No one was paying attention to her. "There's been a small misunderstanding," she said. "But I'm dealing with it." Rachel let out a soft sigh. "We can stop if you want. The deal is done. No one is forcing you to." "I know," Naomi interrupted, but her voice remained soft. "The question isn't whether I can or not. It's whether I should or not." Rachel was silent. Naomi heard the sound of typing on the other end of the line. Then Rachel spoke slowly. "You're always thinking bigger than yourself. That's both a strength and a burden." Naomi smiled, though Rachel couldn't see it. "I learned that very early on." The call ended. Naomi put the phone down. She sat still, doing nothing, not opening emails, not reading the news, just sitting and observing. A voice boomed over the loudspeaker, announcing that boarding would begin in 15 minutes. Several people immediately stood up. Naomi remained seated. She thought of Ethan Brooks, not with anger, but with a question. Did he know what he was doing? Or was he just repeating a system-approved habit? She thought of Marcus Lee, a small man in a large system, a man who chose kindness even when no one asked him to. Naomi realized that this story, though it began with a very personal moment, was no longer just about her. She stood up when boarding was called. She lined up with the others. There was no priority lane, no red carpet, just a slow stream of people moving toward the metal doors leading to the plane. Naomi followed them, calmly, but inwardly, something had become clearer. If she gets on this plane and does nothing, everything will continue as before. But if she chooses to act, not because she feels offended, but for others like her, perhaps something will change. She handed her ticket to the boarding pass. The scanner made a small green beep. The door opened. Naomi Carter walked up the stairs leading into the airplane cabin, and at the same time she knew she was entering a different phase of this story. The North Sky Airways cabin had a very distinctive smell. A cold metallic scent mingled with the smell of old carpets, freshly brewed coffee, and a hint of strong perfume lingering from the previous flight. Naomi Carter stepped through the door, the pale yellow lights illuminating the narrow aisle where passengers had already begun finding their seats. She paused for a very brief moment just to orient herself. To the left is the first-class cabin. Spacious, light-colored leather seats. Plenty of legroom between rows. The passengers here speak softly and confidently as if this space belongs to them. An elderly man carefully places his cashmere coat on the back of his seat, as if it were a precious object. Naomi glanced to her right. The aisle led to the back where the economy class seats began. Narrower, brighter. The overhead compartments were nearly full. She walked along the path to the right. The flight attendant stood right between the two compartments. Her name tag read, Laura Mitchell. Blonde hair was styled in an updo, and she wore bold red lipstick. Laura glanced quickly at the ticket in Naomi's hand, then looked up at her, her gaze clearly appraising her. Row 42, Laura said in a flat tone. All the way back. Naomi nodded. Thank you. She pulled her small suitcase down the narrow aisle, carefully avoiding the armrests. Those already seated began to look up, then turned away again. No one paid attention for long. Naomi hadn't expected that. As Naomi walked past the first-class compartment, she caught a glimpse of a familiar face. That's Ethan Brooks. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a white shirt, sleeves rolled up, leaning over to talk to a passenger in the front row. He smiled, a friendly smile, very different from the cold demeanor he had this morning. The moment their eyes met, Ethan paused, just for a second. Then, he turned away as if he hadn't recognized Naomi, or as if recognizing her at this moment was unnecessary. Naomi didn't change her pace. She continued walking. Row 42 is near the back of the compartment. Close to the restroom, the smell of disinfectant lingers in the air. Middle seat. Both seats are occupied. On the left is a middle-aged man wearing headphones, eyes closed, head resting against the window. On the right is a young woman trying to stuff an oversized handbag into the compartment under the seat in front of her. Naomi stood still, waiting for the other woman to finish. She didn't rush her. When the woman sat down, Naomi placed her suitcase in the top compartment, but it was already full. Laura Mitchell appeared from behind, arms crossed. That bin is full. Naomi looked up. Are there any empty compartments? Laura sighed, as if the question was a waste of her time. You'll have to check it. Naomi nodded and took her suitcase down. She placed it under the seat in front of her where space was already tight. As she bent over, Laura leaned over, glanced into the first-class compartment, then turned back and spoke softly but loud enough for Naomi to hear. Try not to block the aisle. People back here tend to take longer. Naomi looked up. Her eyes were calm. I'll try. Laura didn't answer. She turned away, her high heels clicking softly on the floor, leaving a silent space behind her. Naomi sat down in seat 42E. The back of the seat in front of her was so close that her knees lightly touched it. She adjusted her coat, placed her bag on her lap, then slid it under the seat. She exhaled very softly. The loudspeaker blared, announcing that boarding was nearing completion. Passengers' conversations faded, giving way to the familiar sound of the auxiliary engine starting up. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't feel angry. That surprised even herself. Instead, there was a different feeling, more distinct, sharper. It feels like being placed right into a box that someone else has prepared for you. It wasn't because she wasn't capable. It was because they thought she shouldn't have more than that. She recalled a board meeting many years ago when one member bluntly said, "Naomi, you should be grateful you're even here." She didn't react. She just nodded. And a few months later, she was the one who signed the decision to completely restructure the company. Not for revenge, but to do the right thing. The loudspeaker blared again. All passengers, please take your seats. Laura Mitchell walked down the aisle, checking the seatbelts. When she reached Naomi, she glanced quickly, then pulled the curtain separating the first-class compartment shut. The thick, dark gray curtain completely obscured her view. A small act, but very clear. Naomi gazed at the curtain for a few seconds. She wondered how many times in her life invisible curtains like this had been drawn before her. She placed her hand on the seat belt and fastened it. A small click sound echoed like a punctuation mark. Up front, in the first-class cabin, there was laughter. Someone was ordering a drink. A voice called out, "Champagne, please." Naomi opened her eyes. She looked straight ahead. The seat vibrated slightly as the plane began to taxi. She felt the movement distinctly, as if the entire cabin were drifting forward together, though not everyone knew where they were going. Naomi's phone vibrated softly in her jacket pocket. She didn't rush to take it out. She knew who it was. And she knew that this moment was no longer about whether or not to act. But when exactly? She opened her phone. A text message. Short. Very clear. Clearance confirmed. Aircraft Asset Registry updated. Naomi finished reading, then locked the screen. She didn't smile. She didn't sigh. She just put the phone back in her pocket. Laura Mitchell walked past again this time, carrying a drinks cart for the front compartment. She didn't look at Naomi, but Naomi could clearly see her reflection in the cart's gleaming metal surface. A middle-aged black woman sat in the middle seat near the restroom. No one suspected she held anything other than an economy-class ticket. The engine noise grew louder. The plane accelerated. Naomi pressed her back slightly against the seat. And then, the plane came to a standstill. It didn't come to a complete stop, just an unusual slowdown. The engine noise changed. A few passengers looked up. Naomi sensed that moment very clearly. It was as if an invisible hand had just placed itself on the plane's signaling. Wait. She didn't move. No one in the compartment knew what was about to happen. But Naomi Carter knew. She looked straight ahead. The curtains separating the first-class cabin swayed gently as the plane slowed down. Another silence is forming. And this time, it wasn't the silence of being scorned. Rather, it is the silence before the order changes. The North Sky Airways cabin had a very distinctive smell. A cold metallic scent mingled with the smell of old carpets, freshly brewed coffee, and a hint of strong perfume lingering from the previous flight. Naomi Carter stepped through the door. The pale yellow lights illuminating the narrow aisle where passengers had already begun finding their seats. She paused for a very brief moment, just to orient herself. To the left is the first-class cabin. Spacious, light-colored leather seats. Plenty of legroom between rows. The passengers here speak softly and confidently as if this space belongs to them. An elderly man carefully places his cashmere coat on the back of his seat, as if it were a precious object. Naomi glanced to her right. The aisle led to the back where the economy-class seats began. Narrower, brighter. The overhead compartments were nearly full. She walked along the path to the right. The flight attendant stood right between the two compartments. Her name tag read Laura Mitchell. Blonde hair was styled in an updo, and she wore bold red lipstick. Laura glanced quickly at the ticket in Naomi's hand, then looked up at her, her gaze clearly appraising her. Row 42. Laura said in a flat tone. All the way back? Naomi nodded. Thank you. She pulled her small suitcase down the narrow aisle, carefully avoiding the armrests. Those already seated began to look up, then turned away again. No one paid attention for long. Naomi hadn't expected that. As Naomi walked past the first-class compartment, she caught a glimpse of a familiar face. That's Ethan Brooks. He wasn't wearing a suit. Just a white shirt, sleeves rolled up, leaning over to talk to a passenger in the front row. He smiled. A friendly smile. Very different from the cold demeanor he had this morning. The moment their eyes met, Ethan paused, just for a second. Then he turned away, as if he hadn't recognized Naomi, or as if recognizing her at this moment was unnecessary. Naomi didn't change her pace. She continued walking. Row 42 is near the back of the compartment, close to the restroom. The smell of disinfectant lingers in the air. Middle seat. Both seats are occupied. On the left is a middle-aged man wearing headphones, eyes closed, head resting against the window. On the right is a young woman trying to stuff an oversized handbag into the compartment under the seat in front of her. Naomi stood still, waiting for the other woman to finish. She didn't rush her. When the woman sat down, Naomi placed her suitcase in the top compartment, but it was already full. Laura Mitchell appeared from behind, arms crossed. That bin is full. Naomi looked up. Are there any empty compartments? Laura sighed, as if the question was a waste of her time. You'll have to check it. Naomi nodded and took her suitcase down. She placed it under the seat in front of her where space was already tight. As she bent over, Laura leaned over, glanced into the first-class compartment, then turned back and spoke softly but loud enough for Naomi to hear. "Try not to block the aisle. People back here tend to take longer." Naomi looked up. Her eyes were calm. "I'll try." Laura didn't answer. She turned away, her high heels clicking softly on the floor, leaving a silent space behind her. Naomi sat down in seat 42E. The back of the seat in front of her was so close that her knees lightly touched it. She adjusted her coat, placed her bag on her lap, then slid it under the seat. She exhaled very softly. The loudspeaker blared, announcing that boarding was nearing completion. Passengers' conversations faded, giving way to the familiar sound of the auxiliary engine starting up. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. She didn't feel angry. That surprised even herself. Instead, there was a different feeling, more distinct, sharper. It feels like being placed right into a box that someone else has prepared for you. It wasn't because she wasn't capable. It was because they thought she shouldn't have more than that. She recalled a board meeting many years ago when one member bluntly said, "Naomi, you should be grateful you're even here." She didn't react. She just nodded. And a few months later, she was the one who signed the decision to completely restructure the company. Not for revenge, but to do the right thing. The loudspeaker blared again. "All passengers, please take your seats." Laura Mitchell walked down the aisle, checking the seatbelts. When she reached Naomi, she glanced quickly, then pulled the curtain separating the first-class compartment shut. The thick, dark gray curtain completely obscured her view. A small act, but very clear. Naomi gazed at the curtain for a few seconds. She wondered how many times in her life invisible curtains like this had been drawn before her. She placed her hand on the seatbelt and fastened it. A small click sound echoed like a punctuation mark. Up front in the first-class cabin, there was laughter. Someone was ordering a drink. A voice called out, "Champagne, please." Naomi opened her eyes. She looked straight ahead. The seat vibrated slightly as the plane began to taxi. She felt the movement distinctly, as if the entire cabin were drifting forward together, though not everyone knew where they were going. Naomi's phone vibrated softly in her jacket pocket. She didn't rush to take it out. She knew who it was, and she knew that this moment was no longer about whether or not to act. But when exactly? She opened her phone. A text message. Short, very clear. "Clearance confirmed. Aircraft Asset Registry. Updated." Naomi finished reading, then locked the screen. She didn't smile. She didn't sigh. She just put the phone back in her pocket. Laura Mitchell walked past again, this time carrying a drinks cart for the front compartment. She didn't look at Naomi, but Naomi could clearly see her reflection in the cart's gleaming metal surface. A middle-aged black woman sat in the middle seat near the restroom. No one suspected she held anything other than an economy-class ticket. The engine noise grew louder. The plane accelerated. Naomi pressed her back slightly against the seat. And then, the plane came to a standstill. It didn't come to a complete stop, just an unusual slowdown. The engine noise changed. A few passengers looked up. Naomi sensed that moment very clearly. It was as if an invisible hand had just placed itself on the plane, signaling, "Wait." She didn't move. No one in the compartment knew what was about to happen. But Naomi Carter knew. She looked straight ahead. The curtain separating the first-class cabin swayed gently as the plane slowed down. Another silence is forming. And this time, it wasn't the silence of being scorned. Rather, it is the silence before the order changes. The North Sky Airways plane didn't come to a complete stop. It just slowed down. An unusual slowdown, noticeable enough for passengers accustomed to flying, but not enough to cause panic. Naomi Carter sensed it immediately. She has flown hundreds of flights over the past 20 years. Flying for meetings, flying for negotiations, flying to sign agreements where others only see the final numbers, not the long nights that lie ahead. She knows the feeling of a plane accelerating. And she also knows the feeling of a plane being held back. The engine sound changed very subtly. There was no screeching of brakes, no violent shaking, just a slight slowdown, as if someone had just placed a hand on the pilot's shoulder and whispered, "Not yet." A few passengers looked around. The man to Naomi's left opened his eyes, removed his headphones, and frowned. The woman to her right lifted her head, still clutching her handbag. "What's wrong?" she whispered, not knowing who she was asking. Naomi didn't answer. She didn't look at them. She stared straight ahead, where the thick curtains separating the first-class compartment swayed gently with the rhythm of the engine. In that moment, Naomi wasn't thinking of Ethan Brooks. Nor was she thinking of Laura Mitchell. She was thinking of a very old question, but one that had never been easy to answer. Why am I doing this? It's not because of pride. It's not because I want someone to apologize. It's because, if I don't do it, who will? She placed her hands on her thighs, her fingers intertwined. Her heartbeat was steady, not fast, not erratic. This calmness wasn't something she'd come naturally. It was the result of years of learning not to let emotions guide her decisions. She recalled the evening before her flight. Naomi sat alone in her office, the desk lamp casting a light on a thick stack of files. On the computer screen were lines of dry legal text: North Sky Airways, asset registry, controlling interest, words whose true meaning was understood by only a select few. Rachel Thompson sat opposite her, her arms crossed. "Naomi," Rachel said, her voice low. "When this deal is complete, you won't just be a shareholder. You'll have the final say." Naomi was silent for a long time. She looked out the window at the city bathed in golden lights. "Power," she said slowly, "is not what I'm looking for." Rachel nodded. "I know, but sometimes it finds you whether you want it to or not." Now, on this plane slowing down, Naomi understood the meaning of that saying more than ever. The voice echoed through the cabin. It wasn't a flight attendant's. It was Daniel Harper, the captain of the flight. Calm, professional, but with a hint of caution. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are temporarily holding our position on the runway, awaiting final confirmation from Control Tower. We ask for your patience." A murmur spread. Not loud, but enough to create a slight sense of unease. Laura Mitchell appeared in the aisle, her hands resting on the back of her chair, trying to maintain a calm demeanor. "Please, everyone remain seated. It's just a little slow." She said that as if she were talking more to herself than to the passengers. Naomi observed Laura. The way she glanced quickly ahead, the way her lips pursed, the way her steps quickened slightly than usual. Laura didn't know, but her body knew. Something wasn't right. Naomi's phone in her jacket pocket rang again. This time, she took it out immediately. A call. No name displayed, but Naomi knew the number. She didn't answer the phone right away. She looked around the compartment. Ordinary people. Faces unrelated to the decision she was about to make, but which would influence it. She closed her eyes for a second. Then he picked up the phone. "Naomi Carter," she said, her voice low and clear. "Miss Carter," the voice on the other end replied. Male. Deep. Unhurried. "This is Operations Control. We're confirming your authorization." "You already have it," Naomi said. "Not a challenge, just confirmation." "Yes," the other person replied. "We just need your final confirmation before proceeding to the next step." Naomi didn't answer immediately. She looked up at the ceiling of the airplane cabin. Small signs with seatbelt symbols were lit up. In her mind, another dialogue was taking place. If I say yes, everything will change. Not just for Ethan Brooks, not just for Laura Mitchell, but for an entire way of operating. But if I say no, things will continue as usual. And tomorrow someone else will be standing on the economy line wondering why they weren't recognized. Naomi opened her eyes. "Proceed," she said. Just one word. No emphasis, no raising of the voice. Confirmed, the voice on the other end replied. "Please stand by. The call has ended." Naomi locked her phone and put it back in her pocket. She didn't stand up. She didn't make any gestures. She didn't speak to anyone. She sat still. The plane shook slightly again. This time it wasn't from the engines. It was due to a very small change in direction. A strange sensation spread through the cabin. The man to Naomi's left looked out the window. "Are we going back?" he asked. "Probably not," the woman on the right replied, her voice uncertain. Laura Mitchell quickened her pace, no longer appearing relaxed. She whispered something to a colleague, then both looked toward the cockpit. Naomi observed it all. She felt neither victorious nor nervous. Just intensely focused, like before a crucial decision in a boardroom. She thought of her mother, of the small kitchen from years ago, of the words, "It is how you work that determines your worth." For Naomi, this action wasn't an act of revenge. It was an adjustment, a small attempt to put things back in their proper place. The loudspeaker blared again. This time, Daniel Harper's voice was clearer, but there was something different about it. A seriousness that hadn't been there before. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are receiving an important update from operations. The airplane cabin was completely silent. Naomi sensed that the eyes of a few people began to shift forward, then swept across the rows of seats, as if searching for answers in other faces. Laura Mitchell stood near the first-class curtain. Her hands trembled slightly as she straightened its creases, even though it was already straight. Naomi knew that at this moment there was no turning back. She inhaled, then exhaled. A storm doesn't always come with thunder. Sometimes it arrives with a silence that lasts longer than usual. And in that silence, a new order was preparing to enter this aircraft cabin. The silence in the airplane cabin lasted for almost another 2 minutes. Those 2 minutes, for those accustomed to precisely timed schedules, felt like an entire afternoon. Naomi Carter felt each passing moment distinctly. Not by the clock, but by the air in the cabin gradually becoming denser, as if someone had just screwed on an invisible bottle cap. Then another sound emerged. Not the sound of loudspeakers. Not the sound of an engine. It was an internal bell ringing from the cockpit. A short ding sound. Definitely. Laura Mitchell, standing near the walkway, turned around in surprise. She raised her hand to the earpiece attached to her collar and listened. Her face changed rapidly, from tension to confusion, then to fear. Naomi saw that. Laura nodded repeatedly, as if receiving instructions. Yes, yes, Captain. I understand. She turned off her headphones, stood still for a few seconds, took a deep breath, then turned back towards the passenger compartment. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. A rare moment when someone accustomed to controlling the space suddenly doesn't know what to say. Finally, Laura spoke, her voice slightly louder than usual. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. We are currently awaiting final confirmation from operations. No one asked any further questions, not because they didn't want to, but because Laura's voice left no room for questions. In the cockpit, Daniel Harper stood upright in front of the control panel. On the main screen, a new window had opened. Not a technical notification, not weather data. It's a record. The name appeared on the first line so clearly that it was unmistakable. Carter Naomi A. Status authorized, controlling party effective 0742 AM ES. Daniel swallowed hard. He had been flying for over 20 years. He had seen many things, but rarely had an announcement like this come after passengers had already boarded the plane. The phone in the cockpit rang. Daniel picked it up. Captain Harper, the voice on the other end of the line, said clear and cold. This aircraft is now under direct asset verification. You are instructed to maintain hold. Let me confirm, Daniel said. Who made the request? A brief silence followed. Then the voice responded. The controlling party, Miss Naomi Carter. Daniel turned, looking out the cockpit window down the narrow aisle of the plane. His gaze stopped at the last row of seats. 42. E. A middle-aged black woman sat very upright, her hands neatly placed on her lap. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She showed no signs of being the person causing this situation. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He switched off the engine, turned to the co-pilot who was looking at him with a questioning gaze. Daniel said nothing. He just nodded. Then he opened the cockpit door. The cabin immediately became even quieter. The presence of the captain in the middle of the cabin, while the plane was holding its position, always carried a certain weight. Daniel walked slowly down the aisle. Each step felt heavier than the last. He didn't look over at the first-class cabin. He didn't look at the passengers who were curiously watching him. His gaze was fixed straight ahead towards the back of the cabin. Naomi Carter spotted him the moment he walked out. She didn't stand up. She didn't wave. She didn't make any gesture to attract attention. But when Daniel stopped at seat 42, their eyes met. Miss Carter, Daniel asked, his voice low. Yes, Naomi replied. She unbuckled her seatbelt, stood up slowly without disturbing anyone. The airplane cabin was almost completely silent. Daniel lowered his voice. I need to speak with you. Privately. Naomi nodded. Okay. She stepped out into the hallway. Laura Mitchell immediately rushed forward, her face filled with panic. Captain, is there a— Daniel gestured with his hand. It's fine. He led Naomi forward, stopping just before the curtains separating the first-class compartment. Then, In front of dozens of watching passengers, he pulled the curtain aside. Light from the first-class cabin spills into the economy-class cabin. Several passengers in front gasped. A woman holding a glass of water stopped mid-sentence. Ethan Brooks, sitting in the front row of first class, looked up, and then he saw Naomi. The realization happened slowly. But when it comes very clearly. Ethan jumped to his feet. "You?" Daniel turned to him. "Please sit down." Ethan opened his mouth to say something. Then he stopped. He looked at Naomi. He looked at Daniel. He looked at the open curtain. Naomi stood still, her eyes fixed on Daniel. Daniel lowered his voice. "Miss Carter, I just received confirmation from operations. According to records, you are the controlling party for this aircraft." Naomi nodded. "Yes." Daniel took a deep breath. "So, can you tell me what's going on?" Naomi looked around the first-class cabin. The faces that had once been confident now showed clear signs of confusion. She turned to look at Daniel. "There were no technical issues," she said. "There was no security threat, just a process problem." "What process?" Daniel asked. "The process of evaluating people," Naomi replied. Her voice wasn't loud, but each word was clear. "And the way it's applied isn't uniform." Daniel remained silent. Naomi continued. "I authorized the property check. That required the plane to stop. No one was in danger." Daniel nodded slowly. "I understand." Ethan Brooks could no longer remain silent. He stepped forward. "Captain, there may be a misunderstanding." This woman. Daniel spun around. "I didn't ask for your opinion." The entire first-class cabin fell silent. Ethan stood still. His face turned pale. Naomi looked at Ethan. Not angry. Not triumphant. Just a very direct gaze. "We met this morning," she said. "Do you remember?" Ethan swallowed hard. I'm just doing my job." Naomi nodded. "I believe you." That answer stunned Ethan more than any accusation. Naomi turned back to Daniel. "I'm not asking for anything more at this time. Just confirmation that authorization has been granted." Daniel looked at the handheld device in his hand. He nodded. "It's been recorded." "Thank you," Naomi said. "I'll sit back down." Daniel looked at her for a second longer than usual. Then he nodded and returned to the cockpit. Naomi turned and walked down the aisle. This time, no one avoided her gaze. Laura Mitchell stood to one side, her hands trembling slightly. Naomi walked past her without saying a word. She returned to seat 42, fastened her seatbelt, and sat down. The airplane cabin remained silent, but it was no longer a vague silence. It was the silence of people who had just realized they had missed something very important. The plane hasn't taken off yet. And Naomi Carter knew this was just the beginning. Because when true power emerges, it doesn't stop at being recognized. It requires responsibility. The airplane cabin was no longer noisy, but it wasn't yet the familiar quiet of a flight about to take off. It was a lingering silence, like when a room has just witnessed something irreversible. Naomi Carter sat upright in seat 42. Her seatbelt was fastened. Her hands rested neatly on her lap, fingers intertwined. A casual glance would reveal her as an ordinary economy-class passenger. But those who had just witnessed the scene in first class knew something had changed. Laura Mitchell stood at the head of the economy class, her back to Naomi. She was trying to rearrange the drinks cart, but her hands were shaking so much that a plastic cup fell to the floor with a dry clatter. Laura bent down to pick it up, her cheeks flushing. Naomi saw it. She didn't blame them. She understood the feeling. When the system we rely on suddenly shifts, the first human reaction is often fear. In front, the first-class curtain remained drawn to the sides. No one was in a hurry to pull it shut. Ethan Brooks stood beside the front row, his hands resting on the back of the seat, his eyes staring straight ahead as if trying to focus on some non-existent point. His suit from the morning had been replaced with a shirt, but his confidence had vanished along with his tie. Naomi's phone vibrated. This time, she let it vibrate one more time before taking it out. Message from Rachel Thompson. Internal audit triggered. HR and compliance are requesting access. This will move fast. Naomi finished reading, but didn't reply immediately. She locked her screen, took a slow breath, then exhaled. She knew what it meant. Once internal auditing is triggered at this level, it doesn't stop at a single action. It digs deep. It flips through layers, and not everyone is ready for that. The loudspeaker boomed, and Daniel Harper's voice sounded more steady this time, as if he had regained his composure after the initial shock. Dear passengers, thank you for your patience. We are coordinating with operations and security to finalize an internal procedure. We will provide an update as soon as we have any further information. There were no lengthy apologies, no detailed explanations. But that tone of voice was enough for everyone to understand this was no minor incident. A ground security officer appeared at the aircraft door. He was wearing a reflective vest and an earpiece. Laura Mitchell approached him and exchanged a few quick words. They both looked towards the first-class cabin. Naomi observed from a distance. She didn't need to hear to know what they were saying. When one process was activated, the other gears would automatically turn accordingly. In first class, a few passengers began to murmur. An elderly woman leaned to the person next to her and whispered, "What's going on?" The other person shook their head, their eyes betraying their confusion. Ethan Brooks took a step back as he saw the security officer approach. "Is there a problem?" he asked, trying to keep his voice normal. "We need to speak to you," the security officer replied politely but firmly. "Privately." Ethan forced a smile. "Now, the other person repeated. Naomi watched the scene, not with schadenfreude, but with a familiar, heavy feeling. She knew that for Ethan this moment might seem like an injustice, a sudden blow, but for the system it was simply the consequence of a series of choices. Ethan turned his head, his eyes unconsciously searching for confirmation from those around him. But no one looked at him. No one stepped forward. Those who had once laughed and talked with him now avoided his gaze, as if it were something contagious. Naomi bowed her head slightly, not out of pity, but because she understood what it felt like to be left alone in a room full of people. The security guard gestured. Ethan followed them out of the compartment, his pace slower than when he had entered. As he passed Naomi, their eyes met one last time. Ethan opened his mouth as if to say something, but then he closed it again. There were no suitable words. The airplane door closed behind them. The first-class cabin felt strangely empty. Laura Mitchell stood motionless in the aisle, as if she had just lost an invisible anchor. She looked at Naomi, then quickly turned away, adjusting her uniform. Naomi didn't blame Laura. She knew that many people weren't bad. They just worked within a structure that encouraged them to see things in a certain way. Naomi's phone rang again. This time, it was a call from Rachel. Naomi picked up the phone. "Naomi," Rachel said, her voice low and urgent. "They've opened a file. Not just about this morning's incident, but about previous complaints as well." Naomi closed her eyes for a second. "I guess so. There are recurring patterns of behavior," Rachel continued. "Discrimination, abuse of power, and some decisions regarding ticket upgrades lack transparency." Naomi opened her eyes. She looked straight ahead. "Let them do their work. This is going to cause a stir," Rachel said. "The press could get involved." Naomi was silent. Then she spoke slowly. "The truth doesn't need to be protected from the light. The call has ended." The airplane cabin fell silent again. But this time, it was a different kind of silence. Lighter, more distinct, as if a layer of fog had just been lifted. Daniel Harper stepped out of the cockpit again. He walked to the middle of the cabin, looked around, and then stopped when he saw Naomi. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice low but serious. "We will need more time." Naomi nodded. "I understand." Daniel hesitated for a moment. "I wanted to say, thank you for keeping everything within safe limits." Naomi looked at him. "It's our responsibility." Daniel nodded, then returned to the cockpit. Naomi sat back leaning against the chair. She felt a slight weariness spreading through her. Not physical weariness. Rather, the weariness of knowing that when one gear is removed, many other gears will have to be examined as well. She thought of people like Marcus Lee, people who did the right thing but were never recognized. She thought of the economy passengers, sitting still waiting, unaware that they had just witnessed a part of a much larger change. She wondered if they would ever find out. The loudspeaker blared again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to inform you that the flight will resume after the mandatory procedures are completed. Thank you for your cooperation." A few sighs of relief were heard, but Naomi knew that for some this flight would never be the same again. She looked down at her hands. Calm, steady. This is only the first act of justice, and somewhere a larger response is being prepared. The airplane cabin gradually returned to its familiar sounds. The creaking of seats as someone shifted position. Soft coughs. Persistent whispers. But one thing had changed. The atmosphere was no longer as carefree as before. Naomi Carter felt that very strongly. She remained seated in seat 42E, but the eyes of several people in the economy class had begun to subtly turn toward her. Not with boisterous curiosity, but with cautious glances, as if they were trying to piece together a complete story. A man in the seat in front turned his head, looked at Naomi for a moment, then turned away again. A young woman pulled out her phone, tapped something on it, and glanced briefly towards the empty first-class cabin. Naomi didn't shy away from those stares. But she didn't try to draw more attention either. She knew the biggest questions weren't in the plane's cabin. They were forming elsewhere. The phone in my jacket pocket kept vibrating. Naomi wasn't in a hurry to listen. She let it vibrate twice, then 3 times. She needed a few more seconds of quiet, however brief, to prepare for what was about to come. She picked up the phone. Naomi Rachel Thompson's voice rang out immediately, low and strained. "This is spreading faster than I thought." Naomi leaned back in her chair. "How did it spread?" "A passenger in first class posted a video," Rachel said. "Her face isn't clear, but it shows Captain America walking out, pulling back the curtain. And then, people started guessing." Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. She had anticipated this. In this day and age, there are no truly private moments. "Has the media gotten involved yet?" Naomi asked. "It's not official yet," Rachel replied. "But aviation blogs and a few major accounts are asking. And there's another problem." Naomi opened her eyes. "Speak." "Ethan Brooks," Rachel said. "His lawyer just contacted us. They say this is a targeted act. An abuse of power." Naomi didn't react immediately. She looked down at her hands. Her fingers were still intertwined, not trembling. "What do they want?" she asked. "A retracted statement," Rachel said. "Or at least a statement to de-escalate the situation. They said he was just following procedure." Naomi was silent. For a long time, she recalled Ethan's gaze as he was being led away by security. Not the gaze of a villain, but the gaze of someone who couldn't believe he could be questioned. "What process?" Naomi asked, her voice even. "A process that allows you to judge people by their appearance." Rachel didn't answer immediately. "Naomi," she said afterward, "I stand with you, but I need you to understand. They won't stop easily." Naomi let out a soft sigh. "I know. The call has ended." In the front of the economy class cabin, Laura Mitchell was talking to a colleague. Her voice was low, but Naomi could still make out a few disjointed words. "HR, compliance, video." Laura turned around and met Naomi's gaze. This time, she didn't look away. She hesitated for a second, then walked towards seat 42. "Miss Carter," Laura said softly, bending down slightly so as not to draw attention. I didn't know this would go this far." Naomi looked at her. "Nobody knows for sure." Laura bit her lip. "I just wanted to say, if I said anything wrong this morning." Naomi raised her hand very slightly. "I'm not here to receive a personal apology." Laura froze. Naomi continued, her voice still low and clear. "But if you really want things to get better, tell the truth when asked." Laura nodded, her eyes reddening. "I will." She turned away, her steps no longer as steady as before. Naomi watched. She felt another deeper weariness spread through her chest. Not from stress, but because she knew that those on the front lines were often the ones most vulnerable when the system was shaken. The loudspeaker blared, announcing that the flight was still awaiting final approval. Some passengers began to lose patience. One man stood up, his voice loud. "How much longer do we have to wait?" Laura stepped forward, trying to remain calm. "We're doing everything we can." Naomi watched the scene, her heart heavy. She didn't want these people to pay the price for a confrontation they didn't choose. Her phone rang again. This time, it was an unknown number. Naomi hesitated, then answered the phone. "Miss Carter," the voice on the other end of the line said with a confidence bordering on arrogance. "I'm Jonathan Reed." Naomi frowned slightly. She knew that name. "Who are you?" she asked, though she had already guessed. "He's a senior advisor to the North Sky Executive Board," Jonathan Reed replied. "And he has a direct interest in this matter." Naomi kept her voice calm. "I'm listening." This, Jonathan said, has gone beyond the scope of a personal incident. It's damaging the company's image. And frankly, the interests of many parties. Naomi didn't answer. Jonathan continued, "We understand your feelings, but there are more discreet ways to handle this." "What do you propose?" Naomi asked. She issued a statement saying it was a misunderstanding, Jonathan said. "We'll handle it internally. Ethan Brooks may receive a reprimand, and this flight will proceed." Naomi smiled very slightly. Jonathan couldn't see it, but she still smiled. "Do you think the problem is my feelings?" Jonathan paused for a moment. "I think she's a realist." "Then, you should understand," Naomi said, her voice still soft, "that systems that operate in silence never correct themselves." Jonathan's voice grew colder. "You're putting yourself in a difficult position." Naomi looked around the economy class cabin. Ordinary people. Tired faces. "I've been in tough positions my whole life," she said. "This isn't new." The call ended abruptly. Naomi put the phone down. Her heart was beating a little faster. Not out of fear, but because she knew that from this moment on things had moved to a different level. It's no longer Ethan Brooks' story. It's no longer Laura Mitchell's story. But it's a matter for those in high positions, those who are used to resolving things in silence. In the cockpit, Daniel Harper was in a frantic conversation with the operations department. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He listened, nodded, then asked questions. The exchange lasted longer than usual. Finally, he took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel said, his voice serious. "We need more time to complete the process. We understand the inconvenience, and thank you for your patience." A few murmurs of complaint arose, but there were also scattered claps. It was unclear why. Perhaps it was simply because someone sensed that this was no longer a meaningless delay. Naomi closed her eyes. She felt the weight of the choice resting on her shoulders. Not the weight of power, but the weight of consequences. If she continues, people will lose their jobs. There might be lawsuits. There might be defamation. But if she stops, so much will never be said. She thought about the question that had been on her mind since the beginning of the flight. Is this just about me, or about something bigger? Naomi opened her eyes. The answer was clear, and somewhere out in the cockpit larger gears are beginning to turn. The airplane cabin gradually returned to its familiar sounds. The creaking of seats as someone shifted position. Soft coughs, persistent whispers. But one thing had changed. The atmosphere was no longer as carefree as before. Naomi Carter felt that very strongly. She remained seated in seat 42E, but the eyes of several people in the economy class had begun to subtly turn toward her. Not with boisterous curiosity, but with cautious glances, as if they were trying to piece together a complete story. A man in the seat in front turned his head, looked at Naomi for a moment, then turned away again. A young woman pulled out her phone, tapped something on it, and glanced briefly towards the empty first-class cabin. Naomi didn't shy away from those stares. But she didn't try to draw more attention either. She knew the biggest questions weren't in the plane's cabin. They were forming elsewhere. The phone in my jacket pocket kept vibrating. Naomi wasn't in a hurry to listen. She let it vibrate twice, then 3 times. She needed a few more seconds of quiet, however brief, to prepare for what was about to come. She picked up the phone. Naomi Rachel Thompson's voice rang out immediately, low and strained. "This is spreading faster than I thought." Naomi leaned back in her chair. "How did it spread?" "A passenger in first class posted a video," Rachel said. "Her face isn't clear, but it shows Captain America walking out, pulling back the curtain, and then people started guessing." Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. She had anticipated this. In this day and age, there are no truly private moments. "Has the media gotten involved yet?" Naomi asked. "It's not official yet," Rachel replied. "But aviation blogs and a few major accounts are asking. And there's another problem." Naomi opened her eyes. "Speak." "Ethan Brooks," Rachel said. "His lawyer just contacted us. They say this is a targeted act. An abuse of power." Naomi didn't react immediately. She looked down at her hands. Her fingers were still intertwined, not trembling. "What do they want?" she asked. "A retracted statement," Rachel said. "Or at least a statement to de-escalate the situation. They said he was just following procedure." Naomi was silent. For a long time, she recalled Ethan's gaze as he was being led away by security. Not the gaze of a villain, but the gaze of someone who couldn't believe he could be questioned. What process? Naomi asked, her voice even. A process that allows you to judge people by their appearance. Rachel didn't answer immediately. Naomi, she said. Afterward, I stand with you, but I need you to understand. They won't stop easily. Naomi let out a soft sigh. I know. The call has ended. In the front of the economy class cabin, Laura Mitchell was talking to a colleague. Her voice was low, but Naomi could still make out a few disjointed words. HR, compliance, video. Laura turned around and met Naomi's gaze. This time, she didn't look away. She hesitated for a second, then walked towards seat 42. Miss Carter, Laura said softly, bending down slightly so as not to draw attention. I didn't know this would go this far. Naomi looked at her. Nobody knows for sure. Laura bit her lip. I just wanted to say, if I said anything wrong this morning, Naomi raised her hand very slightly. I'm not here to receive a personal apology. Laura froze. Naomi continued, her voice still low and clear. But if you really want things to get better, tell the truth when asked. Laura nodded, her eyes reddening. I will. She turned away, her steps no longer as steady as before. Naomi watched. She felt another deeper weariness spread through her chest. Not from stress, but because she knew that those on the front lines were often the ones most vulnerable when the system was shaken. The loudspeaker blared, announcing that the flight was still awaiting final approval. Some passengers began to lose patience. One man stood up, his voice loud. How much longer do we have to wait? Laura stepped forward, trying to remain calm. We're doing everything we can. Naomi watched the scene, her heart heavy. She didn't want these people to pay the price for a confrontation they didn't choose. Her phone rang again. This time, it was an unknown number. Naomi hesitated, then answered the phone. Miss Carter, the voice on the other end of the line said, with a confidence bordering on arrogance. I'm Jonathan Reed. Naomi frowned slightly. She knew that name. Who are you? She asked, though she had already guessed. He's a senior advisor to the North Sky Executive Board, Jonathan Reed replied. And he has a direct interest in this matter. Naomi kept her voice calm. I'm listening. This, Jonathan said, has gone beyond the scope of a personal incident. It's damaging the company's image. And frankly, the interests of many parties. Naomi didn't answer. Jonathan continued. We understand your feelings, but there are more discreet ways to handle this. What do you propose? Naomi asked. She issued a statement, saying it was a misunderstanding, Jonathan said. We'll handle it internally. Ethan Brooks may receive a reprimand, and this flight will proceed. Naomi smiled very slightly. Jonathan couldn't see it, but she still smiled. Do you think the problem is my feelings? Jonathan paused for a moment. I think she's a realist. Then you should understand, Naomi said, her voice still soft, that systems that operate in silence never correct themselves. Jonathan's voice grew colder. You're putting yourself in a difficult position. Naomi looked around the economy class cabin. Ordinary people. Tired faces. I've been in tough positions my whole life, she said. This isn't new. The call ended abruptly. Naomi put the phone down. Her heart was beating a little faster. Not out of fear, but because she knew that from this moment on, things had moved to a different level. It's no longer Ethan Brooks' story. It's no longer Laura Mitchell's story. But it's a matter for those in high positions, those who are used to resolving things in silence. In the cockpit, Daniel Harper was in a frantic conversation with the operations department. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He listened, nodded, then asked questions. The exchange lasted longer than usual. Finally, he took the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel said, his voice serious. We need more time to complete the process. We understand the inconvenience and thank you for your patience. A few murmurs of complaint arose, but there were also scattered claps. It was unclear why. Perhaps it was simply because someone sensed that this was no longer a meaningless delay. Naomi closed her eyes. She felt the weight of the choice resting on her shoulders. Not the weight of power, but the weight of consequences. If she continues, people will lose their jobs. There might be lawsuits. There might be defamation. But if she stops, so much will never be said. She thought about the question that had been on her mind since the beginning of the flight. Is this just about me, or about something bigger? Naomi opened her eyes. The answer was clear, and somewhere out in the cockpit larger gears are beginning to turn. The airplane cabin no longer resembled a typical delayed flight. It was more like a waiting room, where everyone sensed something was happening outside their sight. Whispered calls, eyes glued to phones, text messages typed and then deleted quickly. Naomi Carter remained seated in seat 42E. She was used to waiting in moments like these, waiting for the parties involved to show up, waiting for the real power holders to come into the spotlight, and waiting to see what methods they would choose to keep things under control. Her phone rang. This time, the name was clearly displayed on the screen. Office of Senator William H. Callaway. Naomi stared at the name for a few seconds, not out of surprise, but because she had anticipated this moment would come. When major interests are at stake, politics never stays out of the picture. She picked up the phone. "Miss Carter," a man's voice on the other end of the line said, deep and confident, with the familiar tone of someone accustomed to being listened to. "I'm William Callaway." "Senator Naomi," replied her voice calm. "I'm calling you," Callaway said, "because the current situation is having a serious impact on a major airline, hundreds of passengers, and some public interests." Naomi looked around the compartment. The people were waiting, completely unaware that they had just been subjected to the same rhetoric as the public good. "What do you want me to do?" Naomi asked. Callaway chuckled softly. "I want us to find a reasonable solution together. North Sky is a strategic partner. What's happening can be handled internally." Naomi didn't answer immediately. She allowed the silence to last just long enough for Callaway to realize that this conversation wasn't at the pace he was used to. "Senator," Naomi said slowly, "do you know why this flight was delayed?" "There was a process-related issue," Callaway replied. "And I believe you understand the complexity of large systems." Naomi smiled slightly. "I understand perfectly." Callaway lowered her voice. "Then you understand that exposing everything to the public isn't always the best option." "For whom?" Naomi asked. A brief moment of silence. "For everyone," Callaway said. "For the company, for the employees, and for yourself." Naomi sensed a change in his tone. It was no longer a suggestion. It was a gentle warning. She thought of Ethan Brooks. She thought of Laura Mitchell. She thought of the people in the economy class, the people who didn't have a direct line to the senator's office. "Senator," Naomi said, "I'm not trying to harm anyone, but I'm also not obligated to defend a system if it harms others." Callaway sighed. "You're making a big deal out of a small thing." Naomi looked out the window. The runway was still there. The sun was higher. "No," she said. "The big issue has been around for a long time. It's just that today it's no longer being ignored." Callaway's voice hardened. "You should consider the consequences. North Sky has extensive connections. There are people who don't like being put in a difficult position." Naomi replied, her voice unchanged. "I'm used to being put in difficult situations." The call ended. No farewell. Naomi put down the phone. She felt a more palpable pressure. No longer the pressure of public opinion, but the pressure of those who had the power to make things very complicated. In the cockpit, Daniel Harper was on the phone, his face tense. He nodded repeatedly, jotted down a few quick notes, then hung up. He stared at the screen in front of him, where the instructions were constantly changing. Laura Mitchell hurried to the cockpit, exchanging a few words. When she returned, she paused in the aisle, took a deep breath, and then walked towards Naomi. "Miss Carter," Laura said softly. There are more people who want to speak with you." Naomi looked at her. "Who?" Laura swallowed. "Someone from the FAA and a legal counsel for the company." Naomi nodded. "I'll listen." Laura led Naomi forward. This time, there was no curtain. The first-class cabin was wide open, lights streaming down the aisle. A few passengers looked up, no longer out of mere curiosity, but with the realization that this woman was at the center of something very big. Naomi stopped near the cockpit. A man in a gray suit wearing an FAA badge was waiting. Beside him was a younger woman with her laptop open. "Miss Carter," the man said in a formal tone. "We need to confirm some information." Naomi nodded. "I'm ready." The exchange was brief, but full of jargon. Ownership, responsibility, safety obligations. Naomi answered each question calmly and without hesitation. She had prepared for this moment. Finally, the FAA man nodded. "Your authority is valid. The process is being followed correctly." The woman beside him looked at Naomi, her eyes showing a mixture of surprise and respect. "Thank you," Naomi said. As they were leaving, Daniel Harper approached. "Miss Carter," he said, "the pressure from above is mounting rapidly." Naomi looked at him. "I know." Daniel hesitated. "I just wanted to say, not everyone is prepared to stand up to that." Naomi smiled slightly. "I'm not alone." She returned to seat 42E. This time no one moved out of the way. No one ignored her. The aisle opened up naturally, as if everyone had unconsciously made way for her. Naomi sat down, fastened her seatbelt, looked straight ahead. She knew that from this moment on things could never go back to how they were. Whether the flight took off or not, a line had been drawn. And the most powerful people have just officially entered the game. Naomi Carter sat quietly in seat 42. But the feeling she had now was completely different from when she boarded the plane. Not because of the stares of others, but because of the weight of what she held in her hands. The weight of knowing that just one word from her now could calm everything. The flight would continue. The calls would stop. The powerful would smile, satisfied with a reasonable solution. And then the system will continue to operate as before. Naomi's phone lay still on her lap. Not vibrating, not lit up, but she knew it would vibrate soon. People at high positions aren't used to waiting too long. She looked around the economy class cabin. A man was making a phone call, his voice a whisper of apology for being late. A woman leaned her head against the window, her eyes closed, trying to sleep amidst the weary wait. A child doodled on a piece of paper on a folding table. None of them knew who Naomi was, and that made the choice even clearer. In first class, several seats were completely empty. The atmosphere was different. Gone was the initial, relaxed confidence. Instead, there were tense, hushed conversations and constant glances at their watches. Naomi recalled a distant evening when she was a young manager. A superior pulled her aside and whispered, "You're right. But if you speak out, it will make things awkward for everyone. Sometimes, it's better to keep quiet." Naomi remained silent at that moment. Not because she agreed, but because she had no other choice. Today is different. The phone rang. This time, it was Jonathan Reed. Naomi saw his name on the screen, then picked up the phone. "Miss Carter," Jonathan said, his voice low and controlled. "I just spoke with Senator Calloway's office. We all believe that. It's time to cool things down." Naomi didn't answer. Jonathan continued. "We're ready to issue an official statement. North Sky will commit to retraining staff, a press release, an internal committee, and this flight will take off immediately." Naomi asked, "What about Ethan Brooks?" Jonathan paused for a moment. "He's been suspended. That's a serious step." "And what about the previous complaints?" Naomi asked further. "We'll look into it," Jonathan replied, his voice more vague. "But you understand, not everything needs to be brought to light." Naomi smiled slightly. "That's the problem." Jonathan's voice hardened. "Miss Carter, you have a choice. Either you accept a constructive solution, or you let things spiral out of control." Naomi looked straight ahead. "What do you think is out of control?" "Public attention," Jonathan said. "Simplified stories. Labels that the media love. She'll become an icon. And that's not always a good thing." Naomi was silent for a long time. She thought of her mother. On evenings, when her mother came home, her hands aching, but still sat down to ask Naomi what she had learned that day. Her mother had never called herself an icon. She simply said, "If you do it right, you'll sleep well." "Jonathan," Naomi said, finally, her voice low but clear, "I'm not seeking to be an icon. But I also don't accept injustice being relegated to a minor detail in an internal report." Jonathan sighed. "She's choosing the difficult path." Naomi replied, "That's the only path I can take without turning my back on myself." The call has ended. Naomi put the phone down. She felt her heart rate increase slightly, then return to normal. It felt familiar. The feeling she had just before signing a decision she knew would be controversial. Laura Mitchell walked towards seat 42E. This time she didn't bend down. She stood straight as if she had made a decision. "Miss Carter," Laura said, her voice low, but firm. "They just asked me about what happened this morning." Naomi looked at her. "And what did you say?" Laura took a deep breath. "I'm telling the truth. That I saw Mr. Brooks ask her to leave the priority area. That I didn't interfere. And that, I think it was wrong." Naomi nodded. "Thank you." Laura swallowed hard. "I could lose my job." "Maybe," Naomi said. "But she'll keep something else." Laura nodded, her eyes red, but no tears falling. She turned away, her steps slower but more steady. In the cockpit, Daniel Harper was standing, his hands resting on the control panel. He turned around when he saw Naomi approaching. "Miss Carter," he said, "they are pressuring us to make a decision." Naomi nodded. "I understand." Daniel looked at her, his eyes serious. "If you continue, there will be a formal investigation. It could drag on. This flight might be canceled." Naomi looked out the window. The runway was still there. The sun was high in the sky. "Safety and transparency are more important than the schedule," she said. Daniel was silent. Then he nodded. "I'll let them know." Naomi returned to her seat. As she sat down, a woman in the next row quietly said, "Thank you." Naomi turned around. The woman smiled, tired but sincere. "I don't know what's going on," she said, "but thank you for not letting things go unnoticed." Naomi smiled in response. "We all deserve to be treated fairly." The loudspeaker blared. This time Daniel Harper's voice was straightforward. "Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to inform you that this flight will be temporarily suspended until the completion of the mandatory federal investigation. We understand the inconvenience and thank you for your patience." A wave of reaction spread. There were sighs. There were complaints. But there were also scattered non-uniform but genuine applause. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment. She knew that from this moment on the story had transcended the confines of a flight. The system has been forced to shut down, and when it restarts, it won't be exactly the same as before. She opened her eyes. This confrontation is not over, but the ethical choice has been made, and the price is about to be revealed. The wait lasted for almost 40 more minutes. No one was unconsciously glancing at their watches anymore. Everyone had realized that time was no longer measured in minutes, but in the things that were gradually being revealed outside the airplane cabin. Naomi Carter sat quietly in seat 42E. She wasn't reading. She wasn't using her phone. She just sat, her hands neatly placed on her lap, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Her stillness was a stark contrast to the swirling news outside. Laura Mitchell paced back and forth between the economy and first-class compartments several times. Each time she passed Naomi, Naomi gave a slight nod, a silent greeting. The initial awkwardness was gone. Instead, there was a more confident air about her. It was as if she had accepted that things could never go back to how they were. At the front of the cockpit, Daniel Harper stepped out holding a thin piece of paper. He looked around, his gaze lingering briefly on Naomi, then nodded very slightly. It wasn't a public thank you. Rather, it was a silent acknowledgement between two people who understood what was going on. The loudspeaker blared. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel said, his voice low and slow. "We would like to inform you that following official instructions from the Federal Aviation Administration and North Sky Airways Internal Compliance Department, this flight will be temporarily canceled. Passengers will be assisted in rescheduling their travel." A wave of reaction spread. Not panic, but weary disappointment. Some people stood up immediately. Others sighed, leaning their heads back in their chairs. Naomi observed it all. She felt no relief, no victory, just a heavy, very real feeling. She knew that for many people this was a major inconvenience, and she didn't take it lightly. But she also knew that there were necessary inconveniences that forced the system to look at itself. The aircraft doors opened. Ground staff began boarding, guiding passengers to disembark in orderly lines. Quietly, when she reached seat 42, Laura Mitchell stopped. "Miss Carter," she said softly, "could you wait a moment?" Naomi nodded. "Okay." The passengers left the compartment one by one. The man sitting to Naomi's left stood up, pulled his suitcase, and turned to look at her. He hesitated for a second, then said, "Have a good day." Naomi smiled. "You too." The woman to Naomi's right leaned closer and whispered, "Thank you. Although I don't fully understand. I think you did the right thing." Naomi nodded slightly. "Have a safe journey." The airplane cabin gradually emptied. The sounds grew louder. Footsteps. The rolling of suitcase wheels. The opening and closing of cabin doors. Eventually, only a few people remained. Daniel Harper stepped forward. "Miss Carter," he said, "the investigative unit wants to speak with you." Naomi stood up. She picked up her bag, but didn't immediately sling it over her shoulder. "I'm ready." They stepped out of the plane and walked down the stairs to the ground. The air outside was cooler. The sun was high in the sky. The airport was still bustling with activity, as if nothing unusual had just happened, but Naomi knew that inside some offices some calls were being recorded. Some files were being opened. In a small conference room near the runway, Naomi sat opposite two people. One from the FAA, one from North Sky's compliance department. Questions were asked. She answered. No rambling, no evasion. The exchange ended faster than expected. The man from the FAA nodded. She acted within her authority. Naomi nodded in agreement. I always try to do that. As she stepped out of the room, her phone rang incessantly. Text messages, missed calls, notifications. A link was sent by Rachel Thompson. Naomi opened it. A short article posted less than 10 minutes ago. The title isn't sensational, but it's clear enough: North Sky Airways grounds flight amid internal discrimination review. She didn't mention her name. Not yet. But Naomi knew it was only a matter of time. She scrolled down. Comments had started appearing. Finally, someone dares to speak out. This happens more often than we think. I was treated the same way. Naomi locked the screen. She didn't want to read any further. Not because she was afraid, but because she knew that from this point on the story would no longer be solely under her control. In the distance, she saw a group of people standing near the staff area. One of them looked very familiar. Ethan Brooks. He no longer looked neat and tidy. His shirt was wrinkled, his shoulders slumped. He was talking to a man in a dark suit with a cold expression. A lawyer, Naomi guessed. Ethan turned around. Their eyes met once more. This time, there was no confidence, no defensiveness. Only the emptiness of someone who had just lost the anchor they had always taken for granted remained. Ethan stepped towards Naomi, but the man beside her placed his hand on his shoulder and shook his head slightly. Ethan stopped. They were only a few meters apart, but it was as if there was an invisible boundary that couldn't be crossed. Naomi looked at Ethan, not with judgment, nor with pity. She simply looked at him as a human being, facing the consequences of the very system he once believed in. Ethan bowed his head. He said nothing. Naomi nodded very slightly. Then she turned away. That moment for Naomi was more symbolic than any newspaper article. No apology needed. No controversy required. Just the quiet collapse of an illusion that small power could remain unchecked forever. Naomi stepped out of the airport area, blending into the hurried crowds going about their lives. No one recognized her. No one pointed. No one asked for an autograph. And she liked that. She paused for a moment, looking up at the sky. Another plane took off, the sound of its engine echoing powerful and familiar. She wondered if this flight would ever be remembered, or if it would just be a small line in the report. Perhaps it doesn't matter. The important thing is something has been forced to stop. And when it restarts, it won't be exactly the same as before. Naomi Carter took a deep breath, then exhaled. One chapter has come to an end, but the story isn't there yet. The afternoon at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport passed like any other. Flights continued to take off. Others landed. A constant stream of people moved about, carrying luggage, dreams, and nameless weariness. Naomi Carter walked slower than usual. She was no longer in the airplane cabin, no longer at the center of a barrage of calls. But her body still carried the after-effects of the long morning. A deep weariness, like having just completed a task that required more than usual effort. She pulled her suitcase through the automatic window, stopping at the taxi pickup area. The afternoon sun slanted through the concrete pillars, creating alternating patches of light and shadow on the ground. Naomi stood there for a moment, not in a hurry to call a taxi. She needed a few minutes to breathe. The phone vibrated. This time, it wasn't breaking news, not from an advisor, not from the media. It was a short message from Marcus Lee. Miss Carter, I just wanted to say thank you. Not for what happened this morning, but for the way you looked at us. Naomi read each word slowly. She smiled very slightly. Then she answered, "Thank you for doing the right thing when no one asked you to." She put the phone away. It was the kind of exchange that didn't require any further words. A car pulled up in front of her. Naomi got in and gave the hotel address. As the car rolled away from the airport, she looked out the window and watched the runway recede behind her. A part of her remained there in the empty airplane cabin at midday. The hotel was not far from the airport. Not luxurious, just a quiet place enough to rest. Naomi checked and took the elevator and entered a simple room with a window overlooking the parking lot. She put her bag down and sat on the edge of the bed, silent. It wasn't the tense silence of an airplane. It was the silence of a safe space. Naomi took off her shoes and placed her bare feet on the cold floor. She took a deep breath, then exhaled. The images of the day began to reappear, but they were no longer as sharp as before. They drifted more slowly, more softly. Laura Mitchell's face as she told the truth. Ethan Brooks's gaze as he bowed his head. Daniel Harper's brief nod. The whispered thank you of a stranger. Naomi wasn't proud, but she felt it was right. The phone rang again. This time, it was Rachel Thompson. Naomi. Rachel, said, her voice much softer than it had been that morning. Where are you? The hotel, Naomi replied. I'm fine. The news is spreading, Rachel said, but in a rather human way. Many people are sharing their stories. Naomi closed her eyes. I guess so. Rachel paused for a moment. Do you regret it? The question was gentle, but very real. Naomi opened her eyes and looked out the window. No, she said, but I don't feel relieved either. Rachel smiled softly. I understand. Doing the right thing doesn't always feel good. Naomi nodded, though Rachel couldn't see. Any news about Laura? She's been recognized by HR for her cooperation, Rachel said. The final outcome is yet to be seen. But she's not being isolated. Naomi let out a sigh of relief. Good. What about Ethan Brooks? Rachel asked hesitantly. Naomi was silent for a few seconds. I wasn't following them. Rachel understood. Okay. The call has ended. Naomi stood up, poured herself a glass of water, and drank slowly. She looked at herself in the mirror. Nothing had changed. No aura. No sign of someone who had just shaken a system. Just a tired but alert woman. She thought about the years gone by. The time she swallowed her anger. The time she chose silence because she wasn't strong enough. She thought about other black women who had never had the chance to hear from a senator's office. She wondered if anything could change that today. Probably not. Not immediately. But perhaps somewhere someone will pause for a moment before saying, you don't belong here. That evening, Naomi went down to the hotel lobby. She ordered a simple meal. Sitting at a corner table, no one noticed her. A small family sat at the next table, the child giggling as they spilled water. The mother wiped her child's hands without getting angry. Naomi watched this scene, feeling a sense of calm. There are very small things that keep this world from falling apart. When she returned to her room, Naomi opened her laptop. Not to work. She opened a blank document. No title, no table of contents. She typed a line. What makes a system invisible to the very people who are harmed by it? She paused. She didn't type again. Not every question needs an immediate answer. But asking a question is already a step. Outside, the city lights up. Another long day comes to an end. Naomi turned off the lights and lay down. Before falling asleep, she thought of something very simple. Tomorrow, things will continue as usual. The media will analyze the situation. Meetings will take place. Systems will adjust. But somewhere very deep a crack had appeared, and through that crack light can penetrate. The next morning, Naomi Carter stood at the entrance of another airplane. Not Northsky Airways, a smaller airline, less flashy. No luxurious first-class cabin, but clean, tidy, and quiet. She arrived early, not in a hurry, no assistant with her, no packed schedule of meetings in her head. Just a simple flight taking her to another city for another meeting in a life that goes on. Naomi stood in line, like everyone else. No one recognized her. No one whispered. No one looked at her for even a second longer than necessary. And she felt lighter. A gate attendant looking up at the ticket check looked up. Good morning, ma'am. Good morning, Naomi replied. She handed over her ticket. The staff member scanned the code and smiled. Have a pleasant flight. Naomi nodded. Thank you. That's all. There were no big moments. No spotlights. No system-shaking decisions. But it was this very ordinariness that made Naomi realize one thing very clearly. This is something everyone should have. A journey doesn't need to prove anything. A space doesn't make you question whether you belong. Naomi boarded the plane and found a seat. Economy. Near the window. She put her bag down and fastened her seatbelt. She looked around. Strangers each with their own story. A middle-aged man reading a newspaper. A young couple chatting softly. An elderly woman knitting a scarf. Nobody knew who Naomi Carter was. And today, that's perfectly fine. As the plane began to taxi, Naomi looked out the window. The runway stretched out before her. The sky was bluer than she remembered. She thought of Laura Mitchell. She pictured Laura that morning, perhaps in her uniform, getting ready for her shift. She might have hesitated for a second seeing a passenger treated unfairly. But then she would remember the story she had told her daughter. And perhaps, just perhaps, she will say no. Naomi thought of Marcus Lee. He might still be standing in the economy class, still working quietly. But now he probably knows that someone has seen him. And sometimes just being seen is enough to make someone stand a little straighter. She thought of Daniel Harper. One person fulfilled their responsibilities even though it wasn't easy. One person chose safety and transparency over convenience. And then Naomi thought of Ethan Brooks, not with anger, not with a desire for punishment, but with a quiet question. Did he learn anything from that downfall? Naomi didn't need to know the answer. Because the real lesson of this story doesn't lie in who is right and who is wrong. It's this: the system only changes when someone dares to stop. The plane accelerated. Naomi's body leaned slightly backward, a familiar feeling, benevolent, peaceful. As the plane lifted off the ground, Naomi closed her eyes for a second. She doesn't expect the world to become fair immediately. She doesn't believe in sudden changes. She only believes in small, sustained movements that make a lasting difference. After the plane stabilized at cruising altitude, Naomi opened her laptop, not to work. She reopened the blank document she had started typing the day before. She added another line. Change doesn't begin with power. It begins the moment someone says this isn't right. She paused, read it again, then closed her laptop. Out there, the clouds drift slowly. Below, small towns appear, and then disappear. The story of the delayed flight will continue to live its own life. Some will retell it, some will distort it, some will turn it into a slogan, some will forget it very quickly. But somewhere very quietly, it will touch someone. And then that person in a very ordinary moment will choose not to turn away. And that's enough. Naomi Carter leaned her head back in her chair, looking out the window. She's not a hero. She doesn't want to become an icon. She was simply a woman who had lived long enough to understand that silence was also an option, and not always the right one. The plane continued flying. Life goes on, and somewhere very deep something changed. Quiet, unpretentious. But it was real enough to stay. Naomi Carter's story isn't a grand tale of power. It's a very real story about the small moments we all experience. It could be when you're looked down upon because of your age. It could be when your opinions are ignored in a meeting. It could be when you feel you have to try harder than others just to be treated as normal. The biggest message of this story is not fight against all odds. Instead, it's this: listen to your own feelings. Because so much injustice exists, not because of bad people, but because good people have become accustomed to remaining silent. The story also reminds us that time's true power doesn't lie in making someone feel ashamed. Asterisk. It lies in the ability to stop, look directly at what is wrong, and not turn away. Asterisk. And that the most sustainable change always begins with calm, quiet actions. Especially for those viewers who have lived through many years, this story doesn't urge you to do something grand. It simply suggests something very simple. When possible, choose the right one, even if it's not easy. Thank you for staying until the very end. Your presence and your listening are what makes stories like this so meaningful. If you feel you see a part of yourself in this story, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to tell and listen to stories that touch people's hearts in a sincere and profound way. See you in the next story.